So now it was a matter of time when breakthroughs would happen. So you had first version ChatGPT, second. None of us ever heard of what these versions were doing. The big breakthrough was ChatGPT 3.0. Essentially, ChatGPT 3.0 is like you took almost the entire internet and you put it on these transformer models and you pre-trained it to the extent that it pretty much understood everything that was given to it in relation to one another and so on and so forth.
So P&L impact is not there today because of the point you made that there are lots of these small
Yes.
use cases, but really the full thing is maybe 6-9 months out, which in your mind should start delivering impact next year, and in 2 years from there it should be a very meaningful kind of an impact.
We can possibly be talking 10% in 2 years time from then, which means in 3 years time you can be talking 10%. I'm fully aware that people often say that you have 30-40% of opportunity to automate everything and so on and so forth. But there is more to a bank's overall OPEX than just some set of activities. But 10% is in that scheme of things very, very significant if one are able to do that. So I think a good bank should be able to take an FY27 number separately carved out to show the benefit, and possibly by FY29 you could be talking 10% of your OPEX.
Hi and welcome to another episode of Open Dialogue. Today's episode is actually an audience request. We got many requests both for the topic and the speaker today. And so today we have with us Subrat Mohanty, and our topic for the day is AI in banking. Subrat, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Samir.
So Subrat, let's start a little bit with what has suddenly happened. Like AI has been around for decades.
Yes.
But something has happened suddenly that has brought it front and center, and the world around us seems to have changed.
Yeah.
So what exactly happened?
I mean, how far back in the history do you want to go? So if you look at it, we've gone through almost 70 years of this idea of artificial intelligence. So back in the 1940s, there was a very famous building called the Bletchley Park. Now, this is where Turing and a whole bunch of other code crackers were sitting and trying to decode, Nazi German codes.
Enigma.
So that's where, Turing took interest in this area. And he basically posited that you could have something called a universal machine, which can, basically any computational problem can be reduced to an algorithm. And if you have the algorithm, then you can actually pretty much mimic how the human mind might actually solve a computational problem. He went even further. There is this famous thing called the Turing test, where he said that if you have an interrogator, a human and a machine, and the interrogator only sends text messages to human and the machine, the responses, if the machine can mimic human, then, that's the test for whether it's an intelligent machine or a human being. And mind you, it was more about mimicking it. Whether it was truly understanding the question, he didn't really focus on. But from then, and then of course, in some ways, the father of artificial intelligence, which is Hinton, who won Nobel Prize for Physics in 2024, and another gentleman called Hopfield, and Claude Shannon, based on whom we have Claude as a LLM. All of these people continued to work on this broad idea of artificial intelligence, which was largely at that point in time to see if you could, in some sense, get machines to solve for some kind of decision-making, capabilities of humans through a little bit of understanding of the algorithm through which the decision-making is made. This went through some kind of a boom phase. You had very famously a particular tool called ELIZA, which actually was a kind of a therapeutic tool which would help you with answers if you were going through a certain kind of depression and things of that kind. So it had been fed with a whole lot of answers and so on and so forth. But anyway, I think after some initial, euphoria around all of this, By 1970, this all, went down. They found that the accuracy was not as good. The scaling up for real life business cases were not happening as much as they thought. And that's usually called the first AI winter in retrospect. And that first AI winter went on for about, 7, 8, almost a decade. And then in 80s, again, there was an interest. Largely, this interest was led by this idea of artificial neuron networks or artificial neural network, in which case you could almost, kind of create in terms of basic electronic circuitry, you could almost mimic how the neurons in a brain work, which sort of picked up again till about mid-90s, and then we went through another winter. Most of the time, the constraint was computing, availability of models on which you could, or data sets on which you could train, and sometimes the data sets were fairly limited, which was a challenge. And therefore, you would often have a bit of a hype, and then when reality hit the road, you would find that it would disappoint. A lot of this started changing once you had the internet. Two things happened. One, as people started putting up content, things started getting more digital. New knowledge was created first on digital platforms themselves. Old knowledge started getting documented and started getting digitized, and so on and so forth. So the amount of data and information that was available on which one could train models, grew tremendously, and it continued to grow through the 2000s and the 2010s. Yet there was this particular problem. So we kind of overcame the problem of limited data by mid 2010s, because we had enough and more data all around us. But then you started having the problem of how does one train it on this kind of data, right? So the typical model till then, and many of us would have seen the impact of AI back in 2010, 11 and all, when you could see that even in some of the social media apps, that when you put up a group picture, it would say that this is Subrata, this is Samir, which that nobody told it, and the app is able to figure that out, right? That was early. And actually, quite interestingly, the image recognition is a lower level problem than what the other problem was, which I'll come to. Essentially, there's a thing called convoluted neural network. So it figures out that this kind of image I have seen, and so it's maybe image of a dog. So if you say, is it a dog or is it a cat, it can go back, search, and through the CNN, it can figure out that this is a dog or a cat. But the problem always used to be what to do with text, sentences, because sentences have multiple problems. One is that sentence is a construction based on how over a period of time we have decided on certain syntax. Words have meanings, but those meanings are often in the context of that sentence, right? The famous, not famous, but multiple examples of this kind exist, right? I'll say, I will tip the server, and Avinash will tell me on the other side, Avinash is our head of technology, he will say the server has crashed. So, server, but there are two different things. Now, the machine should know when machine hears server has crashed, that this is Avinash, in the context that the server has crashed, so it means something else. And you and I should know that the server, I'm going to tip the server, and that means that this server is something else. So sentences are complex things, and the syntax of a sentence is very specific to that language, and therefore what is a syntax in English is different from syntax in Hindi. This subject, object, verb, is often, so in English you say, I played football. So it's subject, verb, object, SOV. In Hindi, we'll say, maine football khela, which is I subject, football object, khela. So SOV. So, it's not always easy when you are if you were to translate, it faces this particular problem also, that in the other language, the syntax is also different. So words have different meanings. Syntax is different. So there was always this problem of, in some sense, coming to this idea of how to use natural language to understand, so that machine can understand. And then, of course, after machine finds answer, they can give a natural language answer also. So most of the time till 2015 or 2016, the most advanced idea around this was what was called an RNN, the recurrent neural network, which is you would go word by word in a sentence. You will try to understand that word, what it means. Then you will do a little bit of understanding of the context. And then you would be able to say, okay, what would possibly be the next word? And it would still face some of these problems of context, etc. But if you said that my dog is, black and it loves cookies, by the time it reaches it understands that it refers to the dog, and it won't just think it is some random bird. So, you would start having that kind of training that you could do for it to understand it means dog. But by the time you are in the 50th sentence and you have 3-4 it's, and then somewhere you write it, but it bugged, it won't remember that this it is actually the dog because there are multiple it. So it had this problem of long, it didn't have long short-term memory. It couldn't go back in time and try and have that kind of a memory. So this one was a big stumbling block. So till 2015 or so, and I'm going about this in a bit of a detailed manner. So till 2015, you could still have pattern recognition, and based on pattern recognition of the past decision making things. So for instance, back in 2013-14, I used to work for an insurance company. We had reasonably good pattern recognition capability to say that for some simple underwriting decision, the answer is yes, no. Right? So that is fair. Or you could decide on classification of A, B, C, D, E based on multiple data sets, and you could come out with A, B, C, D, E based on some, previous patterns and some kind of intelligence, which otherwise a human being might have looked at 3 documents, 4 documents, and then put something. But you could not ever come out with a report. You could come out with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, some yes, no kind of thing. Or you could not come out with an original report, which is even more next level of problem. You could possibly collate everything, but you could not come out with someone, the machine actually writing like a human being and telling you, therefore, this is a report. So in 2017 maybe, or 2016 or 17, I think just as, I think it was 17. This famous paper was written by few scientists in Google, one of whom is an Indian, a guy called Vaswani. And it's a very famous paper, and I would request whoever has chance to read it or at least understand the abstract of it. It was called Attention is All You Need. And attention is all you need is the foundational paper for what are called transformers. And those of you who have some understanding of this subject, in ChatGPT, the T is transformer. Now, transformer was a step change over things like RNN, right? So, what the transformer did was, it's like, very simply put, it's like that movie, Everything Everywhere All at Once. So, there was no more sequential understanding of things. So, it was understanding every word simultaneously, basis something called self-attention, which is why that paper is called Attention is All You Need. And every word is like a token, which is why we use the term token these days when we talk about using the LLMs. Each word is a token. Each token can be, its attention can be arrived at with respect to another word in the same sequence based on a set of parameters, right? So you have those 3 parameters on the basis of which you can arrive at an attention for this particular word with the other one. And in a way, simultaneously in parallel, you could have all words being given their own self-attention, and you could have multi-head attention. So you could understand that word in the context of syntax. You could understand that word in the context of just general meaning. Broadly speaking, what it meant was you now saw this as a whole, and each word simultaneously was being looked at individually and in its own self-attention and its relation with another word. And you also had something called a positional encoding. So each word was given a kind of a number, and you could figure out, so you didn't have to take the whole word, you took the numbers and figured out what it meant. Broadly speaking, what it could do was it could figure out that every single word typically is used with which other word and comes together and so on and so forth. Now with that power, you could now read the entire data sets that were available in a more efficient manner than in the past. And as Moore's law continued to build up, you also had these very powerful GPUs, which were, chips of very different kind than the usual Intel ones. Largely GPUs were originally made for video games. And NVIDIA, which is all this big deal right now, was essentially a video game chip provider. But that is where it realized that it needed to constantly build more and more powerful chips, so much so that they actually built eventually most powerful GPUs, more than even Intel, which was actually doing most of the work for corporates at that point in time. So you had simultaneously this compute which could help you to do all of this processing of all of this material in a manner that was efficient and somewhat cheap, or at least you had access to that kind of computing. So now it was a matter of time when breakthroughs would happen. So you had first version ChatGPT, second, none of us ever heard of what these versions were doing. I mean, it was never available. The big breakthrough was ChatGPT 3.0. Essentially, ChatGPT 3.0 is like you took almost the entire internet and you put it on these transformer models and you pre-trained it to the extent that it pretty much understood everything that was given to it in relation to one another and so on and so forth. And then, of course, there is the decoder model also. So when you write a English language simple prompt into that, it encodes and then figures out, and then eventually when it gets the answer, it decodes and gives you back that answer in a natural language program. So to cut a long story, not to cut a long story short, to continue with this long story, over a 75-year period with 2 winters, we have reached a place now where the trifecta of data sets being available, compute being there, and underlying model which is able to do this, able to process this in a manner that is efficient, all of it came together. And once it came together, the last, I would say, 2 years have been maddening in terms of what it is able to do. So, of course, the usual thing is that it is able to, you write a prompt, it's able to give you a full report. So, there is a generative element which I have not spoken about. Basically, it's able to generate stuff, new stuff. But more importantly, as models have evolved, it's also almost able to even make connects that otherwise is not available anywhere, because it is able to see those patterns and those connects, and it's able to infer. So if anybody has used ChatGPT 3.0, you'll realize that or 4, you realize that it's able to give you even more than just a normal, just a response or just a report. So that's where, that's how things evolved. And in the last, I would say even last 9 months, every single new version in whichever area, whichever LLM you talk of, it's just making the possibilities very real and almost instantaneous. So there is, in multiple areas, it's almost a plug and play if you were to do this. So that's really how things have evolved. And broadly speaking, I mean, there is also this question of what is an LLM, what's a foundational model. We'll come to that. But broadly speaking, it started with a text LLM, then we had a visual LLM, then you had multimodal LLM, multimode LLM where it could do both, and now you also have a coding LLM. So large things that otherwise take away human time and effort in one of these LLMs is already sort of in some sense factored in. So that's as they say, a potted history of
Thanks.
AI in the last 75 years.
Thanks for running through that, Subrat. So basically a combination of computational power, which is all these high powered GPUs, the data on the internet, which is almost infinite training data,
Yes.
and as well these models where some real breakthroughs have happened, have given us what is now called Gen AI or generative AI,
Yes.
as you rightly said, which is now mimicking human actions.
Yes.
And that has resulted in this sudden kind of uptick. In fact, I mean, this is very well known that the time it took for ChatGPT to get to 5 million users
Yeah.
was like 2 weeks or something like that, like some insanely small amount of time, as compared to even, let's say, a WhatsApp, which also went viral just about a decade back, or maybe a little bit more. But then that took much more time, and if you go back in time, obviously these numbers are.
Yeah.
So Subrat, if now, so we move now from AI and or the general kind of AI to coming specifically into banking and kind of implications of AI for banking. So firstly, there is a lot that has been spoken about AI. Right, there are some folks who have said that when this comes in, there is going to be widespread displacement of jobs. It can have, very disruptive impact and so on and so forth. First, so 2 questions. First is how do you think about this, and B, where are we in this cycle? Like, are we very early? Are we all this already happening? How do you kind of see this?
So I think that's a good question to sort of focus our efforts right now on where we are and which business are we in. See, at one generic level, every action that we do in the bank, for instance, or maybe in other businesses as well, one is that the actor or the person who is doing it should have the knowledge. And knowledge in most cases is either learnt over time through history, or it is some knowledge that is, so it's like knowledge based on experience, so it's empirical knowledge, or it's some knowledge which is they have, learnt by sitting in classroom and deep understanding of that subject. So that's one part. A lot of the work that we do is based on people using empirical knowledge, and maybe some part of it is both empirical and core domain knowledge and understanding. Then there are certain kinds of work that we do which has the base of knowledge, but then there are perspectives which come from, understanding what's happening in the market, how do we know about customers, where things are dynamic, perspectives keep changing because information around you is changing and so on and so forth. And to keep this model simple, just let's leave it here, right? So there are, in the first bucket, the knowledge that is built on empirical experience, and then based on which you are doing certain actions. Quite honestly, that is something that any reasonably well-trained algorithm can do, and can do with fewer errors because they don't have mood swings or they don't have, attention being distracted at any point in time and all that. So there is a fair amount of work in banking where we are doing empirical based actions. You get a form, you check for 4 things, you find one thing missing, one thing wrong, you go back, you get somebody to change it, or you yourself go into some system, pull out some data, change it, and you keep doing this work on an ongoing basis. The ability to understand that form, the ability to go out, pick up that information from some database and you pull that out and so on and so forth, it's based on today the human being knowing all of this. But that's the kind of work which technically can be replicated by a machine. This is not even generative in that sense, but it is definitely not just a yes-no pattern recognition thing. It's a little more than that. And that work, I would say, we are your question on where we are, 6 months back, we were still, I would say, in the hype cycle. Today, this particular problem statement is looking very real in terms of its solution. The core question is, do you just pick up one of these things and do it, which you can? And the other question is, do you start looking at it in a wider kind of a frame of saying what are the adjacent processes? Can we look at all of it together? Because sometimes optimizing just one particular process might not necessarily give you all the benefits. It might give you just local benefit there. So we are at this stage where definitely it's looking way more plausible. In fact, there are use cases where you know this particular work can easily be done. So that's that kind of piece. And my sense is we are at, early stages of testing, getting many of these things off the ground. But once they go, we will be very quickly getting into scale because there is very limited constraints to scale here.
So if I think of this, Subrat, basically, if you think of most of the quote-unquote operations in the bank,
Yes.
let's say you're opening an account. So some form comes in, somebody types a few things, checks a few things, then says it's okay or not. Or there is a transaction that comes through, now you have to kind of put that transaction through. Or there is a service request, somebody wants a checkbook or wants to change their address. You look at the address proof, you kind of, all of these activities will fit under the bucket that you are talking about. And if you take any commercial bank, a reasonably large part of the commercial bank actually is doing things like this. Is that a fair?
That's a fair assessment. The challenge is in operationalizing this,
Right.
and it takes some time.
Of course.
But once you have got that and you get one or two things off the ground, this is, you are right that a large part of a typical retail or even a commercial bank has activities that are largely this. In some sense, it's a combination of intelligent data entry and mid-level decision making in terms of choice of what to be, choosing from in terms of a decision that you need to make to send it to this queue or that queue kind of a thing. But so let me sort of open this up a little bit just to take that thing, right? You have a form. It's an account opening form. And somebody is looking at that and we have to make sure that this account opening form is, in some sense put into the system, and whatever else needs to be done gets triggered once the account is officially, you believe that it checks all the boxes to open this particular account, right? So when you take that form, what the human being does is they run their eye over multiple fields. And now each one of those fields, they are using in their head what possible data they should be seeing and what they should not be seeing, which is essentially a finite set of fields and options. And these are already there somewhere within our system. So that data, those fields, that structure is available. So tool can be trained on saying that, well, if you see this and that fits into, where within your database this particular thing is there, then it is a check. So a lot of these checking activities straight off the bat. Then you have a place where you might say that there is something which is blank. It is left blank deliberately because I have to fill it. In which case I have to go query some database, pull some information out and put it here. Now that query could be a reasonably simple query or sometimes even a medium complex query. This is where some human being is using some intelligence to be querying that. Now that's where that querying activity has to become, if it has to be done by a algorithm, then a whole lot of orchestration below that has to happen, right? The data should be not messy, it should be clean, data should be flowing, the ability to create a query buy a machine which is relevant to that particular blank field and all of that. Those are slightly more complex activity. And to your point, if you do 4 of these but still have a human being come in for that 5th one, it takes away some of the gains that you might get. You'll still get some decent gains. So 6 months back, I think a whole lot of these things was possible. Maybe this blank would have been somewhat of a, barrier. Today, this blank is not a barrier. If you have got decent amount of what I call enablement already done, then you should be able to query and pull the right information and put it there. So my view is that the current use cases are good one-off, and there are many one-off use cases. And that you can constantly just keep doing on a one-off basis. You might not fully get a lot of benefits, but a lot of experience. And that should be done by everyone. And then as you are making sure that enabling layers, etc., are being put in place, you can start hitting the more complex, like the querying, picking out the right ones. And then you can go to the next level of complexity, which is, actually making some decisions, etc., which is not there in the past also, or it has some limited data of the past, but you are yourself making these kind of decisions. So on the process side, I think multiple use cases today for the one-off kinds, and early stages for the more, integrated, more complete kind of solutions. And my view is we are maybe 6 to 9 months away from some of the simpler, integrated, full end-to-end kind of work. So I have a feeling that 1 year down the line, this conversation would be way more real and way more, I would say, magical in a way in terms of what we are able to do.
Great. No, I think just to kind of illustrate this point a little further, what basically you are saying is that if you look at a end-to-end process, and processes are end-to-end, right? Like whatever you build, like let's say if you to build a piece of software, then just writing the code is not the end of it.
Right.
Somebody has to kind of first think of the requirements. You have to write those requirements. Those requirements have to be translated in technical language. Then somebody writes it.
Yes.
Then somebody does a system integration test, which is a test at the level of that particular piece of code. Then that piece of code has to integrate into a larger system.
Yes.
Then the entire system has to be tested. Then it has to go for information security testing. Then you have to do some CUG and so on and so forth. If this entire thing is 6 months, the act of writing the software itself is maybe a month.
Yeah.
And so if you fully AI it, that 1 month will become 2 days. But then your 6 months will still be 5 months and 2 days.
Yeah.
And so you are not really getting the benefit.
Yes.
And so what you're saying is that like what is available today is just this act of writing the code. What in 6 to 9 months should happen is that this entire thing likely will be repurposed for AI, in which case instead of, going from 6 to 5, we go from 6 to, let's say 2 days or 3 days or whatever it is. And that's where the real power lies. Today we have lots of these singular use cases.
Yeah, that's true. The fact is that even that 1 month being brought down to 2 days is nothing to sort of scoff at. It's a decent.
Absolutely.
Sometimes it is the highest cost part of the value chain. And also sometimes the quality of what is coming out now vis-a-vis what an average coder would have done. This quality is more sort of reliable. And therefore you have lower risk of, recoding and going back and redoing the entire thing. But you are right. So especially in banks, I mean, you could be only a coding company, in which case this is large part of your work.
Yes.
But in a bank, we might have that as a 20% or a 25% of the total life cycle of what we are planning to do. If you have to take coding, if you have to take software development as an example. So yeah, so we'll do this first and we get some experience, but don't lose the overall view that this is a smaller part of the overall component. Real value is when you are able to look at it from an end-to-end perspective.
Right. So hence just to kind of go back to our original question, number one, this is real in your mind.
Yes.
And it is coming. It's not yet come, but it is coming. And already the point use cases are many. and already you can see in real deployments actual benefit come through. At some point in time, all of these have to come together and like have an end-to-end where we will see material outcomes. In your mind, that starts happening, let's say 6-9 months from now. So this is very close. It's not a
No.
and it's a very, very
I mean, we have already, I mean, so for instance, since we are talking coding, in our IT team, now we have enabled a fair number of people. I mean, in another 1 month or so, it might be of the total programmers, we might have almost 70% of them enabled on this code assist thing, right? So think of it very simply that now all the coders in our technology team have, through a particular multi-tenant sort of a platform, have access to all the LLMs, right? And there are very specific coding LLMs which are there. I mean, Claude is one of them. Claude Sonnet is one of them, and there are a few others. So we have enabled them in a manner where through this multi-tenant platform, they are able to pick any one of them. And if you were to say that I have to, write a piece of code for developing a new product journey on our mobile app, it is almost now at this, the level of ease that is there now available for our programmers is that they see the wireframe, they pretty much just write in English what they are seeing in the wireframe, they upload a couple of previous R design templates, etc. And in within another 5 or 10 minutes, you get a fully written piece of code, fairly optimized, that is available for you to just take and port. And same things are available to fix a bug, change something from one programming language to the other. This is already available. So right now there is already a reasonably decent critical mass of people who are doing this. And so, in a real use case, we are picking up a project right now where the development time would have otherwise been anywhere, say, between 80 to 90 days. Right now, based on this, we are saying it is 39 days and it's still not fully optimized. So you are able to bring it down almost by a third. And that's a reasonably large chunk of work, which was otherwise a 90-day effort with usually a 6-7 member team. But these individual pieces are just available and they are like available on the fly for anybody to use it. So now, as we have got one large part of the team given, those who are not being given are starting to complain. This is the first time I am noticing that somebody is complaining that I am not getting access to a tool which somebody else is getting to. And I was joking that I'll be very happy if somebody threatens to put in his paper because he's not or she's not getting access vis-a-vis the old problem of I don't like what the compensation is or I don't like what the rating is. So I said, let them complain till we reach a place where somebody is almost threatening to quit, which means that there is real value to this, not just for the people who are seeing, people who are on the sidelines are feeling left out and they are actually demanding it. But right now the demand is real.
right.
So this is, it's no longer in the realm of possibility. This is already on the ground as it is happening today within the bank.
Right. So, Subrat, just moving on. So, obviously, we spoke about two areas which have clear use for AI. First one was operations. Second one was technology development. Which other areas you think can?
Yeah, I think the actually before both of these we had picked up the other one, which in our case was contact center. Now there are different ways of looking at this, but let's take an inbound call center in a very classical model, and this applies to pretty much every bank and maybe many other service industries. Each bank's contact center is organized around various products. So you will have a team for credit card, you will have a team for home loan, you will have a team for your savings bank account, so on and so forth, right? And which is why if you call a typical bank call center, you will be first given a menu at the very beginning. Do you have a credit card problem or you have a home loan issue or whatever? Press 1, 2, 3, whatever. And based on that, you go to that particular team, and that particular team assists you, right? And then that's how the work goes on. Now, and that's just the construct of it. Now, the classic challenge we have in a typical call center is customer calls a agent, and customer first has a query, agent tries to answer it, customer goes in 3-4 different ways based on their original query. We have tried our best over a period of time to map those various, trees or the branches in which the customer will go, and we have trained the agent. So if he goes to branch A, then the agent knows what to do, branch B, branch C. As much as possible, we have tried. The challenge is that there is reasonable amount of attrition, and every agent is not the same. So often the agents don't have fully an understanding of where the conversation is going. Sometimes they don't use the available tools enough. Sometimes those tools are not always easily they can access during the call, and so on and so forth. So there is one problem, that even a nicely trained agent is not fully able to give every answer if the customer goes down different paths. Sometimes new paths also emerge. And therefore the customer might not get the right response. The second part is that customer, after having done one set of query on their credit card, before wrapping up the call says, actually I have one small problem with the regular savings bank account that I have. The current model is such that unless you have a very good agent who has earlier been trained on that product and now is sitting here, they would not be able to give an answer. They'll say that I will transfer you to that department. And in fact, in some cases, we encourage it also because it's safer. Otherwise, you'll give possibly a wrong answer. It is none of your business to be giving this answer. And cross-training people on multiple products at that level is, everybody's tried, but that level of attrition is impossible. And therefore, that guy gets transferred to another, and that guy takes the call from there. So the thing that we were planning, or we were asking ourselves is there enough currently in terms of AI capability that when the customer is calling and speaking to this agent on the card, and as they speak, like we have established, we now have two capabilities. The AI agent can understand the natural language of the customer. I mean, in the sense, the language that the customer is speaking can be quickly transcribed into text, and it can happen instantaneously. So you can have a scenario today that when the customer is speaking, the agent is understanding the customer, and the AI agent is also simultaneously understanding the customer. And by the time the customer has finished, the AI agent, if trained well, has already pulled part of the answer or all of the answer that you must offer to the customer. So you are not letting the AI agent speak to customer, because that can feel fairly artificial. But you have an agent who now, apart from their own domain knowledge or training that they have got, has a real-time assistant who's interpreting what the customer is saying real time and is starting to show on your screen, this is the possible answer that you should provide. This person might choose to or might choose not to, because sometimes these models hallucinate also. But they have this on a real-time basis. Can that be done? Was the question. Because if you can do that, then you are leading the conversation. Everybody is leading the conversations of the customers in exactly the same manner and in the best possible manner, based on what is the best possible information we are able to retrieve from the back. And that makes customer experience more uniform. That takes away all the fear of this person not understanding that customer, so on and so forth. Now, this in our mind is a huge opportunity in making customer experience better, because you have well-trained agent now supported by very good quality real-time assistance. And every time you do this better and faster and more efficiently, you are able to spend some time with the customer to offer another product or another service, so on and so forth. And more importantly, now if the customer asks a basic question on another product, the AI agent has no such allegiance to any one single product. So they will give you the first level answer also. And the first level answer can be closed here itself. So it sounds very incremental. But when you sit in a call center and you know what this means and you know how customers come, what they do, this is actually quite transformational. The ability to have every single agent of ours at any time have this assistant which is able to give them that right answer, lead them in the right direction so that the customer is satisfied, and then not having to transfer the customer to a senior agent or to an adjacent team because you have the answer to that is huge. In my mind, done well, you can run at a quarter of the current size of your call center. Anyone who's doing this well, because there is almost in 3/4 of the time that is going in trying to understand, asking customers to repeat, taking wrong direction, passing on to somebody else, getting them to listen to our corporate, music and all of that. And the improvement in customer satisfaction scores will be tremendous. Same thing can be inverted to an outbound calling as well in terms of real-time assistance. So we picked this one up first because for us, this was a good, more tangible end-to-end use case. And it doesn't stop here because once you start training this, then you can have this person take a customer through an entire journey of opening an account, opening a credit card, or onboarding on a credit card, which means that you are almost opening out a completely new journey now, which is not a branch, which is not assisted calling and getting them to open a credit card, but it's an agentic AI, as they call it, who is taking them on a new journey altogether. So this particular piece, which is a more complicated piece, because again, we might come to this conversation on what does it take for you to reach this level and therefore get into this implementation. We've been at this for almost 9 months now, right? With a decent amount of comfort now that we will be starting to get this off ground. But this is a more complicated end-to-end example where we are not directly interfacing with the customer, but we are taking a full end-to-end journey with a real-time AI assistant, which is using Gen AI capabilities to support our team.
Understood. So there is operations, there is software development, there is contact center. Any other?
I mean, the simpler use cases. So, for instance, a whole bunch of work that we do with ad agencies, not for this fantastic TV ads or something, but there are a whole internal marketing collaterals we use when we send it to our channels for them to use it because they go and present something to the customer, or they internally when we have communication for our stuff. So these are not non-trivial expenses when you take a fairly large organization like ours. In the traditional model, for every single collateral, you would have to go to a ad agency. They would take the thing, they would write the content, then they would figure out the best picture, they would put it all, they would send it to you, 4 or 5 different options. They will all come one day, they would have put it on a chart. I mean, all kinds of stuff happens. On an average, I would say it would take 3 to 4 weeks, very efficiently done, in order to release a set of 4 or 5 collaterals for a particular theme, right? And it would cost you something. And when you aggregate it, it's a fairly large cost. Honestly, we have already done this. This is all less than 1 day work now. It's all, I mean, you can generate the content. Content is way better than, I mean, let me put it this way. It will never be an award-winning content, which will get you something at the Cannes, but it is better than any mediocre content that you get from an ad agency otherwise for this kind of work. And more importantly, many of these LLMs actually generate images also. And not just generate images which are very lifelike, which are very relevant. All you need to give is a prompt saying there is a young couple and the background is, a nice hill station and this color scheme, this kind of clothes. It generates a fairly good, accurate image based on the prompt that you've given. And they indemnify you for that image so that there is no copyright risk that you carry. So they are able to bring all of the images, generate it, and make it such that it is original, that it doesn't, and this is already happening. And if I were to just extrapolate this entire piece of work of being able to create content by pulling 3-4 different sources of information and based on your prompt, is the standard piece of work that is being done in multiple departments in the back, right? I mean, you want to go to meet a client, the sales guy needs a short summary of what the customer does, what our relationship is, so on and so forth. There is a whole team that does many of these activities. This is all same thing. You can pull that information out from multiple sources in the net about that company. It might be better, more relevant, more new. You can pull what our relationship value is with that customer through our database, and you can give them a template and a thing on this is how I would like it to be presented from next time on. Every time you next time press this company, I mean not press, you write this company's name and you put some additional prompt, it will give it to you in the same format. So this large amount of content generation from various sources and putting that together in a structured format is a use case that is available. And as the marketing example suggests, that you can extend to many parts of the.
Yeah. And performance marketing in particular, not just the image generation, but the entire life cycle.
Life cycles also.
Choosing which channel, running the ad.
Which is working, which is not working.
All of this can be done actually very efficiently and much better by an AI versus human, because in the manual way of doing this, there is always a lag. You run a campaign today, you have to wait 3 days to get the results and tweak it and so on and so forth. Machine can probably do it real time. I think again something that's happening.
Yes, as we speak.
Great. Any other interesting use cases that you've seen that?
So there is this classic thing of if you are largely, we are a Microsoft enterprise shop. So we use Microsoft, we use Outlook, we use Teams and so on and so forth. And if you have got Copilot, then the entire business of taking minutes of the meeting and summarizing it, making sure that whoever name was mentioned, that name gets highlighted so that person who's ever opening that minute exactly knows where their names was. So now I have small use case. In the last 3-4 months, I have told, that I've decided that I will not reject a calendar invite. If there is a conflict, I will choose the one that I think I should attend, which is more important. Earlier, I would have rejected and that would not sit on my calendar. Now I have decided I'll not reject it. Because if I don't reject it, at the end of that meeting, if it's on Teams, which is always there, even if you are having a physical meeting, we do have Teams on, then it sends me the summary of that meeting. So, which is why I keep it on my calendar. So what that allows me to do is, even if I have not attended the meeting, I can at the end of the day just open that summary and figure out what has happened in that meeting. Apart from if there has been a mention of my name, etc., then it comes through. But more use, the more better use case for this is a whole host of work that we used to do earlier in creating requirements document for any IT project. Quite honestly, it's now a matter of making sure that everybody does that meeting in Teams. We upload the standard BRD template of ours. We upload a few of the older BRDs in this relevant area, which have been there in the past. And then you have the Teams meeting in which you do the discussion on the requirements. You just about manage it in a certain way so that you avoid English right now so that it doesn't get confused. And you just call out now we will discuss this so that it is clearly established. The first outcome of this is almost a 40-50% ready BRD document, which means you have halved the work. And my sense is that it's only a matter of couple of months where you will have a 90% close to actual BRD document. Again, this work could otherwise have taken a couple of weeks going through. You had 2 meetings, 3 meetings, and everybody would somebody would write a document and then pass it through, 4 or 5 different people who would have to approve it or not approve it. Then it will come back, then you'll have to rewrite the whole thing. This thing almost makes it instantaneous if you were to do this. So, again, that's a useful, model of having a co-pilot along with your entire Microsoft Enterprise Suite. A whole bunch of things now are just automatically enabled and available for you.
So just on this one, so basically today the way things work is that, let's say we want to put something on a mobile app. So first there are 4 or 5 different teams who will need to input into this.
Yes.
So as an example, if it is, let's say, a loan journey that we want to put, then we need to have the loan team because they'll talk about what the credit product is. We need to have probably the compliance team, the risk team, the credit team, the operations team.
Yes.
And all of these people will give their inputs. And then there is somebody who's writing what you are calling a BRD, a business requirement document, which basically says that this is what the technology should do.
Yes.
So screen 1, so and so, screen 2, so and so, call these APIs, etc., etc., etc. What we are doing now is that instead of somebody writing this document, all these conversations are happening on Teams, so they are recorded, and you put whatever supporting emails and previous documents, etc.,
and previous templates,
and so on and so forth, and then you press a button, and the BRD is ready.
Yeah.
Which is a real, by the way, this is not again hypothetical.
Yeah, no, this is not hypothetical. We're doing it.
We are doing it as we speak.
Yeah.
So it's actually quite fascinating, right? The other one of my favorite actually example is on MIS actually. So we had done a POC. This is a POC. We just created some dummy data, some template. We put it onto the AI, and then we started asking some questions. So as an example, one question we asked was, how many accounts were opened in Mumbai yesterday? So what the AI did, it wrote a piece of code which it would then query the database with. And the code it had written was that go to this particular column, and the column is pin code, and see pin code starting with 400.
Yeah.
Count it as 1, and then submit, and that's the number.
And nobody taught it.
Nobody told it that Mumbai is 400 pin code, or what pin code means, or and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
It just came up on its own with something like this.
Yes.
And that is just mind-boggling actually, that it can do this.
So I think that just to push that a bit forward, the next level of question is, we might call Mumbai West 1, and it might have 3-4 other things. Now this is Mumbai 400 LLM knows.
Yes.
because it is there on the overall internet, it is available. Now West 1 is not known to the world, it's only our internal nomenclature. Now imagine when we are able to bring this internal nomenclature of what is West 1 or whatever else, what is zero balance account definition or something of that kind, into this. This translation is one decent heavy lifting work, which we are doing as we speak. The ability to have this object based, data sort of categorization, which is going to then you have an LLM and you have an internal chota LLM which understands all the internal nomenclature, and then that is just going to be all powerful.
Right.
So even with the current one, you can query a whole lot because it will, like in this example, figure out on its own what is Mumbai. But in some cases, if you say West 1, it will draw a blank because it doesn't know what West 1 is. It has not been trained yet. And you can do it on a one-off basis, but there is no fun in that. If you do it for the entire, so which is why one of the core things here is what is the state of play for your data in terms of, one, it's its availability, what kind of data lake, etc., how clean, how are the pipes and how well they go, what's the governance around that. Even if you have very good all of that, this particular problem of training that on your data nomenclature is a different problem. And at scale, for the kind of data that we have, we are a very large organization, you'll need some serious data engineering effort in order to do this. Which is why I believe that maybe other jobs will be finite, but data engineering jobs for the next 5 to 10 years is possibly one of the most, it will be happening, but it will be also one that has the maximum quantum in the terms of number of jobs created. You will not have this jobs at the next level of what we used to call the typical data science, insight, analyst kind of guys. That can get very quickly automated. But this work of getting everything enabled and getting it ready and getting it at scale very, very quickly, that's a huge employment opportunity or whatever job opportunity of this in the near future.
Right. And you broach a very interesting point, Subrat, which is if you kind of think like, even today, but if you rewind maybe even 12, 18 months back, analytics was it was a job family, meaning there were folks who were, and very smart guys, very, very smart guys who are somewhere between technology and business. Actually, they are neither. They are neither technologists, they are neither business guys, but these are guys who can look at data and, come up with insights, write models and the like. Actually, what's happening with AI now is that this ability is just fully democratized.
Yes.
So now you don't actually, data analysis today is not about data science or data modeling, etc. It's about prompt engineering.
Yeah.
Right? You need to know how to write the right prompts, and then you will have everything that you need. So it's another very fascinating kind of shift that has happened because of this.
Yeah, the danger here is that you might have with if you really play it out for the next 12, 18 months, you've got a whole lot of data engineers, and one of the internal work that we have done for the last 12 months as part of one of the programs within our business intelligence team was focused on data engineering. Just build data engineering capability as much as possible, and we called it internally Project Meta, and we kept driving at it. Say in the next 12 months or so, even all of this data is now available, and it's useful, it's easy to understand that, and so on and so forth. You might actually have a reverse problem that so many people would have worked and made this easy that the number of insights through decent enough prompts are more than what management can handle.
Yeah.
Because then your problem will be, don't kill yourself with too many insights. You need to know which insight. I mean, somebody needs to be able to curate some of these and tell them that look at these 3 or 4 things. Otherwise, every morning you'll be saying, let me first check how many sales guys have 0 accounts opened this month. But let me also see that how many have done or below insurance sales this month. And then at the end, you will have some 6 different tables and you have no idea what you should be doing at that point in time. Today, because of lack of that kind of speed, somebody sitting somewhere is deciding these are the 4, dashboards you need to see. And in those dashboards, there is this red, green and amber. And therefore, you are red in these 2, focus on that. A lot of our thinking around the future is we don't need to send any of the dashboard. You need something, you type and you get it out and you will see it and you will figure out what it is. But it assumes that level of information or intelligence, when it is made available and democratized, it won't paralyze this person to what to do in terms of action. Sometimes just curating it and serving it is still a better model to get people to act rather than leaving it to their own devices. After some time, they won't know what to query and they'll stop querying it. So that danger is there.
Right. The final kind of arena so we spoke about ops, we spoke about contact center, we spoke about software development, we spoke about MIS and analytics. The kind of there are 2 actually other areas. One is the sales side itself, which also we spoke about how can all of this enable the sales guy do better sales. But the last one actually is the customer proposition itself, which is, AI, like we have every bank and we do quite well on digital. So we all have our digital propositions. But there could be AI enabled propositions which kind of help customers, us serve customers directly without any, any of the.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so which is that point on, can I sell a personal loan starting from thinking about in my current set of customers who might be the most relevant, or at this moment, which is the most opportune set of customers to whom I should be offering a personal loan. Today, that problem statement is taken by a team who then run through entire database, are querying different things and keep on improving it on an ongoing basis based on feedback, etc. And they come out with some base of whatever you call it, pre-approved base of customers that can be done. This work doesn't need any human beings, so you can start from a pre-approved base which is done by by AI. You decide that I will, in some sense, over a period of time, groom this customer by a set of nudges, by asking them some question, by looking at some pattern of their spend, knowing that a particular date in a day of a month or a particular time of the month, they might be more willing to take a personal loan to tide over something, or maybe they have overspent, and so on and so forth. To then crafting the proposition of what is that size and amount of personal loan, to then making it available to the customer on a link on a WhatsApp or in their app itself, to you clicking it, the agent looking at it, deciding that this customer has clicked, they have asked for this much, make a counter offer. The customer says no to the counter offer, make another counter offer, play around with the rates, play around with the amount, give them a range of options saying you seem to be not undecided. You can play around with this and you can get a amount, a rate, and a tenor, interplay. Now all of these, if you go back 10 years, maybe 15 years back, this was all being done face to face. After some time, it was done through a combination of face to face and some, technology. Then it started getting done purely digitally, but with some human being coming at some point in time and making these choices, etc. But if you look at this whole thing, the entire thing can be essentially, in that sense, an agent which is AI driven or agentic, and they can almost run this at scale. At a single point in time, 500, a single instance, there are 500 such conversations happening, which today is not possible.
Correct.
And you can exhaust that set faster. You can decide to wait for this than send it, because you now don't have a tyranny of any kind of capacity constraint. And therefore, you are even sometimes not bothered about the fact that the customer is taking more time to decide, etc. You're like, okay, I'm having 500 conversations going on. If I have a hit rate of 2 on 500 also in this 1 minute is not a bad order. 2 minutes is not a bad deal. So you will have a very different proposition, not just as it will be almost like a full product team plus the sales team plus the operations team, which is all AI driven with almost very limited human touch. Maybe there is a human touch to have a maker, to have a checker at occasional periods going in and checking for things. So that possibility is there. There are some 3-4 such product propositions today that you can envisage a future where it is just machine or a AI driven product and an AI driven business unit which runs on its own.
Absolutely. So Subrata, let's move on now from use cases to two topics. One is what does it take to deliver this? And maybe let's start with that. Like, what does it take to deliver and to win?
I think if you take fairly brass tacks kind of stuff, you need a good data layer. By that, what it means is your availability of data. And so, I mean, very simply put, every organization will have some structured data. The structured data might sit in multiple places, might have different, at times, labels to it for the same data and so on and so forth. That itself is used to be a huge problem and a challenge of all of the data warehousing and everything that used to happen, used to be to solve for this. But you need to make sure that at least your structured data is now across the system has the same typology, the same definition, and so on and so forth. And then organizations have unstructured data, which is all kinds of emails and data that is not. I mean, it's like free text that is there in various places and so on and so forth. So, and you've got text that people are writing. Is it part of a note that they are attaching to a CRM because they have gone and met a customer and they have put a note and so on and so forth. So there are all kinds of notes, documents, etc., which might be written in free text and not in a structured format. And then there is a whole host of data that is around the organization, where there are external entities from whom you are drawing some data, and there is external data that is sitting and so on and so forth. So there is a good amount of work in order first to make sure that structured, unstructured, external, all of this data is, you are able to bring it together and you are able to warehouse it within your within the bank, and be able to create a model where you are able to pull this data at different points in time for whoever wants, and you are able to check for its recency, for overlaps and things of that kind. Most decent organizations would have been on this journey, but this is easily a 2-3 year effort if you have not gotten it started, or you are not as good as maybe best in class here. Once you have that kind of data, then there is the data engineering challenge of how easily it flows. It's not messy. It has the ability to be retrieved fast, and you don't have to pull all the data. If you have to do a certain thing, you can pull only parts of it. So there is a fair amount of data engineering effort, which is essentially making sure that the pipes are laid out at different places, and pipes are made in a manner that you are not having a full crisscross of pipes going here, there. That is fairly clean. So I think that's a very core fundamental part to getting this started. Right. Once you have that, the second right now, which I think is a big area of focus, is the ability to get your people trained on many of these things. And this has two parts. One is the motivation for them to get trained, which is always sometimes a challenge. Only that many people would want to go and learn a new thing. The second is, how do you make it available within your organization in a manner where they can, train, play around with different LLMs, with different use cases and so on and so forth. And that enablement also takes some time in terms of making sure. But there are now multiple these kind of multi-tenant platforms available, where you can go out and go on that platform and try out on the different ones. We use Amazon Bedrock, for instance, and you can then, you don't have to have individual deals with LLMs, etc. You can get it done with one single multi-tenant platform. But more importantly, that training, that enablement, etc. is done in a manner where you are monitoring it and you are constantly asking use case after use case, so that they are getting tested on small and bits till you have certain sense of a critical mass of people who understand this. And this then goes to the next level, where if there is reasonable understanding at that level, how do you take this and make it a organization wide agenda, which is, this asymmetry is a problem. The ability of what AI can do is known to few people who are sitting in one part of the organization. they often might not have full access to the small, minute efforts that are happening in various parts of the bank, which aggregated is a very large effort, but individually is invisible to people. That how many in the bank are just downloading 3, documents, checking for 2 things, and then uploading those 2 documents. I mean, at one level, this might be like 30% of what the bank is doing if you aggregate it. But somebody who's sitting with good AI knowledge is not able to appreciate that kind of work aggregated is 30%. So somewhere this asymmetry can be only broken if there is good understanding at the senior level that the power of this is tremendous, and I have to, in one way or the other, break this information asymmetry problem, either by placing these guys there or by insisting that some people within the business team who are doing this kind of work immediately get trained on this. The good news is that programming, which used to be the constraint, even earlier you could say that it would have been great if somebody who's sitting and doing my everyday account opening, account onboarding work, if you could hire 3 engineers there instead of regular people, get them to do that. After some 6 months, the 3 engineers would eventually start programming and doing something there in order to automate that. But it was always difficult because firstly, you can't get 3 programmers to do that. They would get bored. And even if after that, if they start doing that, then they would have to go through this whole cycle of, writing and getting it approved, so on and so forth. But today the possibility is that you can actually train somebody there because coding is almost like writing English language. If you have trained them to some extent, they themselves can actually start using some of these tools in order to automate that work, and they don't need too much of help or effort. You need to enable them. But this asymmetry problem is the problem that leadership can accelerate by getting things going. So which is in my mind a reasonably good responsibility that the leadership team can go ahead and run with. That apart, there is obviously still a cost issue. That will get solved on its own. I mean, right now, the costs are coming down quite dramatically, especially after DeepSeek, because those guys showed that you don't need as much of computing that these guys seem to be suggesting in the past. And then everybody has to compete and possibly learn from them in terms of how they have become so efficient. But otherwise, I would say even 3 to 6 months back, the costs were not as affordable as it was made.
They were quite prohibitive, actually.
They're quite prohibitive. 6 months back, they were quite prohibitive. It's already dived quite a bit, and my sense is that all it needed was a disruptor like DeepSeek. Otherwise, there was a feeling that there is good amount of cartelization to say that let's keep the cost at a certain level. But I have a feeling the cost problem will go away in a year's time.
Yeah, and Moore's law will.
It's anyway working, so that will happen.
So cost should come down dramatically. So Subrat, then the last, actually not the last, but the second last question is, I was reading this report by McKinsey, and they had this very nice quote. So it said that if you look at corporate world, AI is everywhere except in the P&L.
Yes.
So please demystify this.
Yeah. See, I think the P&L impact of this is, I would say, the first, if you have been an early adopter, which I think we are, the first stab at a P&L impact in my mind is possibly in FY27, where we can put a stake on the ground and put a number. And I still think that the first impact for the first year will be very, very happy if that number is 1% of our OPEX. And that's not a small number, but it's a small number if you look at it in a way. If you look at it in a rupee crore basis, it's
450 crores.
In our case, it would be 450 crores, but it's still 1%. But I have a feeling that this is one of the things where, unlike, see, whenever in the previous, whatever this kind of mega trends that would come or appeared like coming, say cloud, and everybody would say that you can go up or down depending on your capacity. This is a, you get an elastic capacity and you only pay for the bulbs that are turned on. When you don't need them, you turn it off, etc., etc. All of those conceptually was right. Some of it actually played out the way it played out. But no matter what math you did, you realize that there is some savings, maybe some flexibility, but that's pretty much it. Still, we have to go because the overall functional sort of benefits are quite a bit, or technical benefits are quite a bit. But after some time, you know that it is the runway is only that much. Once you put everything on cloud or whatever regulatory, guidelines allowed you to do, there is only that much, and you can optimize for cloud. You can play around with 2 different vendors, and you can get some cost savings out of that. But beyond that, you have already factored that into your cost base, and you get that much. Here, my sense is that if you get 1%, then that 1% becoming 10% is not the 10x leap that you might think it is.
Right.
In fact, in any other case, 1% becoming 10% is possibly 100 times the effort.
Correct.
Here you might have 1x go to 10x with maybe 2 or 3 times the effort. And that, I think, we'll have to wait and see. But right now, to me, that is how it appears. That if you are able to get 1%, then 10% is maybe you'll have to do 2 or 3 times the effort of what you did for 1% to start getting 10% outcomes. So, to come back to your P&L question, I have a feeling that, at least in our case, taking a 1% as a marker for next year, with all other things that we do and we do well, we can possibly be talking 10% in 2 years' time from then, which means in 3 years' time you can be talking 10%. I'm fully aware that people often say that you have 30-40% of opportunity to automate everything and so on and so forth. But there is more to a bank's overall OPEX than just some set of activities and some headcount reduction, etc. But 10% is in that scheme of things very, very significant if one were able to do that. So I think a good bank should be able to take an FY27 number separately carved out to show the benefit, and possibly by FY29 you could be talking 10% of your OPEX.
Very interesting. So P&L impact is not there today because of the point you made that there are lots of these small
Yes.
use cases, but really the full thing is maybe 6-9 months out, which in your mind should start delivering impact next year, and in 2 years from there it should be a very meaningful kind of an impact. Fantastic. So then last question, Subrat, which is, as you rightly said, like unlike the previous mega trends, which were, I would say, they were mega trends, but they were still incremental, right? They would kind of change the trajectory a little bit. This is very fundamental. So what does the bank of the future look like?
I mean, one of the simple ways of looking at it, one of the discussions that we were having, and Amitabh made this point, that a bank of the future should be that there is no maker. There is only a checker. At one level, it is easy to keep it at that level because there are other. You can talk about a lot of things that we'll have this layer, that layer, architecture, etc., etc. A lot of making can be done with very minimal human effort, and to the extent that how much of a kind of work that we do is a making kind of work. If you really look at it, a lot of making has already gone out of the bank. Everything that we do digitally, the making is with customer.
Correct.
And we do the checking. So this is in some sense a logical next step. You might say that it's a logical next leap. It's not just a step. So this idea of a bank that does very little making, either the making is done by the customer or it is auto done, is a simple way of looking at that. Now it's up to us to figure out how much of what we do is really making. In some cases, it might be making and checking. In some cases, it might be making with intelligence already, with some kind of insight and knowledge that is difficult. But if I were to put a different lens to this, you could be running a bank 3x the balance sheet with the same number of people, is one way of looking at this. So maybe if you get to 3x of the balance sheet in say next 8 years or 7 years, given whatever compounding you might apply in terms of growth. So if you do in the next 8 years 3x of the balance sheet, you could say that 8 years later I might be running with the same size of the bank in terms of strength. That's possible. So if I were to extend it out to FY say 33, 34, I would say that you have a balance sheet 3 to 4 times of what we are today with the same number of people, which is quite a, which will be quite an efficient, very different bank if you think of it. And then there are other aspects of, how decisions are made, the absolute real time nature of doing things. So the other bank of the future, aspect could be that there is almost zero latency. His customer is not asked to wait because the wait is because today that decision has to go from one human to the other or one workflow to the other workflow. And then another person comes in and applies their mind. But in many of these cases, it can be that latency is not needed because there is always another agent who is able to pick this job up. So the other metric that I often think of in my mind is ask how many zero latency kind of flows you have today. You might talk in exceptions only in future about processes that have latency. Otherwise, most processes should be as real time as possible, especially when you're dealing with the customer.
Fantastic. So, zero latency,
Zero maker.
no makers, all and makers. I mean, when we say makers, our mind typically goes to again the op shop.
No, it's all over.
Makers is everybody's a maker, right? So we are talking of, in a very conceptual way, a bank which just runs by itself, with very limited, manual oversight, and kind of things just happen through machines. Of course, there are people, but then people are doing, they are kind of there to ensure that nothing is going wrong. And B, obviously, you have to continue to do newer and newer things, and some of that they are bringing in. But otherwise, businesses and business as usual is run by machines. And you put out a great benchmark as well, which is you could perhaps run a 3x balance sheet with the same number of people. So Subrot, since you brought this topic up, then one last question, so what does this mean for the future of jobs in banking?
I'm 50, so I'm not 50. I'm turning 49 next month, so I'm off. So it's a useful question to think over, right? So there are 3 ways of looking at this. 2 of them optimistic, one somewhat, different in terms of thinking. One is most AI evangelists will talk about something called what is called the Jevons paradox. So Jevons, Jevons, people should go and read up. One of the early thinkers on what is called marginal utility. I mean, Carl Menger was the father of marginal utility, but Jevons was also there. So Jevons paradox is very simply put that there is traffic, and you think that the solution to traffic congestion is by building wider and better roads. Jevons paradox is the minute you build wider and better roads, more people will buy cars and there will be more traffic congestion. Or the other way of putting it is, and this is seen in real life, that if oil becomes the primary constraint for automobiles, you would think that the difficulty in able to extract oil or whatever, the limited nature of the oil would make people buy fewer automobiles. But the fact that you are able to extract oil so easily gets more automobiles purchased. And the same thing happened with coal and steamship. The fact that you had steamships made people feel that coal will now become the constraining factor. But the fact that steamships were so efficient, you found more and more coal and more steamships, one way or the other. So the Jevons paradox model says that, the more AI is used, the more people will start working on AI and more number of things will happen which will create jobs in AI itself or in adjacent industries. So you should not worry about it. It's classic case of things, the more you use it, the more it gets people to come in and it gets people to engage with it. So that's one, and that is possible. How it is possible right now maybe is slightly beyond our ken, but it can happen as it has happened in multiple other industries. The second is that classic thing which you go back in history of time, we all think we are living through the most revolutionary phase of this world. But it happened with the Industrial Revolution, especially in 1870s, 1880s, when you had three big breakthroughs, right? You had electricity, you had telecom, the telephone started, and you had this ability to build tall buildings, skyscrapers and things of that kind, especially in the US. And the nature of the industry changed from production, manufacturing to services because the manufacturing got so much more efficient. Agriculture also was there, but since manufacturing got efficient, more people came to cities, more industries started, construction started and so on and so forth, and more people started servicing those. So jobs that never existed started getting created. So there was no entertainment industry, for instance, at scale. People used to go watch some local programs. The entertainment industry, the entire whole entertainment industry started because people came to cities and they started having leisure. Right? They were not working from morning 8 till evening 8 because machines started doing it. Some workers might still be working, but a whole lot of managerial class emerged and so on and so forth. So now we are worrying that the services jobs are going away. Manufacturing is already automated. This worry is that if services job go away, what will come? We don't know because nobody could have, in 1870, they would have told that 50 years later, in 1930, you would have a full thing called Hollywood. They would be like, what are you saying? It's like we don't have there is no, 60 years later, there is no understanding of such a concept. So I have a feeling that is also an opportunity that you have all of this automation, time gets released, some other utilization of the time starts happening, which creates jobs of its own. And it's a sort of a cyclical thing. So that's second. The third is no, none of these happen. In which case human beings get freed of labor, but they have no other way of earning for themselves because there is no job to do. But there is great value accumulation at a societal level because unit productivity has shot up, in the sense that what 100 rupees could do in terms of productivity, now that is 10 times that because you don't have a human being, there are all these agents, AI agents doing that work. Then we'll go back to this old concept of how to distribute that value so that we don't do other bad things, which is essentially a one or the other versions of a universal basic income kind of a model. My sense is that in most times in history, people think that third one is the only option left. But so far, 1 and 2 have happened. So I have a feeling that we should not be alarmed about this. We should think of it as another evolution, and the job problem is not the big problem in my mind. It should get taken care of, all of this. There are other perils of AI, which sometimes I am more, I have some sympathy towards, of machines, not exactly going sentient, but starting to have, their own, in some ways, starting to disobey the human command and so on and so forth. Those things are somewhat possible if we were to not have a good set of guidelines. I'm in Elon Musk camp there. He's always been a bit worried about working towards any notion of singularity. I think that's a little bit of an area that should be more worrisome than pure job losses. Job losses, I think we should be able to handle.
Superb. Subrata, thanks a lot for that
Sure.
conversation. Very wide-ranging. We started with the history of AI. We spoke about, and where we basically spoke about how a culmination of the increased computational power because of all these high-end GPUs, almost infinite data sets because of the internet, and new modeling and techniques of that nature have come together and created this generative kind of an AI which has suddenly sprung out of nowhere almost.
Yes.
And become a big thing. We then spoke about applications to banking, where we spoke about 5-6 different types of applications, to operations, to contact center, to software development, sales, and customer propositions. The big takeaway from there is that for various reasons, we are at a place where lots of small POCs have done very successfully, but the real value will come from creating end-to-end use cases, which is maybe 6 to 9 months away.
Yep.
And so at this point in time, it's not like we are there, but we can sense and smell and touch and feel that it's coming in some time. We spoke about how it is fundamentally changing a few things. So as an example, just this notion of data analysis and the role of the data analyst, or how software development happens, or how makers do their job, is all changing very fundamentally. This is not a marginal 5%, 10%. It's actually a very fundamental change. We spoke about how it is not yet in the P&L, but then in FY27 we should see the first kind of P&L impact of this, and in 3 years that can be very meaningful. We also spoke about what the bank of the future looks like, which is a no maker kind of an entity and a real time, no latency kind of an entity. And finally, what it does for jobs, where it could turn out to be a extreme case, everybody's unemployed type of a thing, but more likely, given what we've seen earlier in history, human kind will just find its way around it.
Yep.
New opportunities will come up. There'll be new roles which we can't envisage today just because we don't know. But new things will come up, and there'll be new forms of employment creation. And so, hopefully with this, just like we moved from, let's say, somebody sewing to now machine sewing, and then they're doing something else, or with the manufacturing boom going from lower paying jobs to higher paying jobs, here again we kind of make that leap, and it increases productivity at the overall economy level. Fantastic conversation, Subrata. Thanks a lot for your time, and we hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as we did.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening into this episode of Open Dialogue. I hope you enjoyed this as much as we've enjoyed bringing it to you. We are overwhelmed by the response that we've received and really look forward to your comments and feedback. Do like and subscribe to our channel to keep track of new episodes that are coming through. Thank you.